In 1944, Britain stood on the winning side of history. Its cities were scarred, its people exhausted, but its flag still flew over a global empire. From the outside, Britain looked indispensable, a nation that had endured the worst years of war and emerged with its prestige intact. Victory appeared not just military, but moral, economic, and permanent. Yet beneath that image sat a quieter reality. Britain had not survived the war on strength alone. It had survived on credit, on promises, and on obligations that would not be settled when the fighting stopped. The war had been won, but the balance sheet had been emptied. What followed was not chaos or collapse. There were no riots in the streets, no sudden breakdown of institutions. Instead, control slipped away through agreements, loans, and systems that felt reasonable at the time. Each decision solved an immediate problem. Together, they reshaped the future. This raises a question that history rarely asks directly. How does a nation win a global conflict and still lose command over what comes next? By 1944, Britain's military position had stabilized, but its financial position had quietly deteriorated. 6 years of total war had consumed not only manpower and industry, but capital itself. Gold reserves were depleted. Foreign assets had been sold or pledged. What remained of Britain's wealth existed largely on paper, locked behind controls and obligations that limited real flexibility. To sustain the war effort, Britain had transformed its entire economy into a spending machine. Production was directed, prices were managed, imports were rationed, and private capital was subordinated to national survival. This system worked in wartime, but it left little room for recovery once peace approached. There was no surplus waiting to be redirected. There was only exhaustion. More importantly, Britain could no longer finance itself externally on normal terms. Before the war, it had been a global creditor. By 1944, it had become a debtor nation, reliant on support from allies to maintain basic trade flows. Food, fuel, and raw materials increasingly arrived not because Britain could pay competitively, but because arrangements had been negotiated in advance. This was the contradiction few saw at the time. Britain looked powerful because it was mobilized. But mobilization masked fragility. Strength was being performed through control, not generated through growth. The war had preserved Britain's status, but it had quietly hollowed out the financial foundations that once supported it. Lend-Lease is often remembered as generosity, a lifeline extended to an ally in its darkest hour. And in the narrow sense, it was. Without American supplies, Britain could not have sustained its war effort. Ships, fuel, food, and industrial inputs flowed across the Atlantic at a scale Britain could no longer finance on its own. But Lend-Lease did more than move resources. It altered leverage. Britain was no longer choosing how to allocate scarce capital. It was negotiating access to it. Payment was deferred, but not eliminated. The cost was not immediate repayment, it was dependence on continued approval. This distinction matters. Emergency aid during a crisis always comes with implicit conditions, even when formal ones are delayed. Britain's ability to plan its post-war economy became constrained by assumptions about American preferences, American priorities, and American tolerance. Strategic decisions were increasingly made with an external audience in mind. The program also forced Britain to liquidate much of its remaining overseas wealth. Assets built over generations were sold to fund survival in the present. This was not conquest in the traditional sense. No territory changed hands. No flag was lowered. Yet economic autonomy narrowed. Lend-Lease solved the problem of today by borrowing from tomorrow. And once the war ended, that tomorrow arrived quickly. Britain discovered that while military victory could be shared, financial independence could not be reclaimed as easily as it had been surrendered. At Bretton Woods in 1944, Britain helped design a new global monetary system intended to prevent the chaos of the interwar years. On the surface, it was an act of leadership, cooperation among equals to stabilize trade, currencies, and capital flows. In reality, it marked a turning point in who would set the terms. The system that emerged placed the US dollar at its center, convertible into gold and backed by an economy that had grown stronger during the war, not weaker. The pound, once the backbone of global finance, was repositioned as a secondary currency, still important but no longer decisive. Britain accepted this not because it was persuaded, but because it had no viable alternative. Fixed exchange rates limited Britain's ability to adjust internally. Capital controls constrained flexibility, and reserve currency status, once lost, could not be recovered through policy alone. Monetary autonomy gave way to coordination, but coordination did not mean symmetry. This is the subtlety Bretton Woods reveals. International systems are presented as neutral frameworks, yet they reflect underlying power balances. Rules apply to everyone, but consequences do not fall evenly. For Britain, participation required defending an overvalued currency, prioritizing external credibility over domestic recovery. Nothing about this felt like defeat at the time. It felt responsible, sensible, even necessary. But embedded within the new order was a permanent shift, from issuer of the system's rules to manager within someone else's framework. And once that transition occurred, every future decision became more constrained than the last. In the years after the war, Britain's greatest challenge was not rebuilding its cities, but defending its currency. Sterling still carried symbolic weight as a global unit of trade and reserves, and abandoning that status felt unthinkable. Prestige had become a policy constraint. Repeated sterling crises followed. Each time, pressure mounted on the pound as trade deficits widened and capital sought safer ground. Rather than allow a clean adjustment, Britain chose defense. Interest rates were raised, spending was tightened, imports were restricted. The domestic economy absorbed the strain so the currency could project stability abroad. This choice reflected an assumption inherited from empire that credibility must be preserved at all costs. Yet credibility financed by sacrifice is fragile. Defending an overvalued currency drained reserves and delayed investment in productivity, housing, and industrial renewal. Growth became secondary to appearance. What made the trap so persistent was timing. Every defense bought temporary relief, reinforcing the belief that the strategy was working. But each intervention also weakened the underlying economy, making the next crisis more severe. Stability was being rented, not earned. The sterling crises reveal a pattern that repeats across history. When nations cling to legacy status, they often mistake recognition for strength. Instead of adapting to new realities, they use policy to preserve symbols. The result is not immediate collapse, but slow erosion, a cycle where maintaining prestige consumes the very resources required for genuine recovery. By 1946, Britain's room to maneuver had narrowed to almost nothing. Wartime support had ended, exports had not yet recovered, and dollar shortages threatened basic trade. The solution on offer was an IMF loan, framed as stabilization, discipline, and a return to normalcy. The conditions attached were not unusual by international standards. Sterling was made convertible, capital controls were relaxed, fiscal restraint was imposed to restore confidence. In theory, these measures would integrate Britain smoothly into the post-war financial system. In practice, the timing was disastrous. Britain was still physically damaged, industrially strained, and socially exhausted. Opening the currency invited immediate outflows. Dollars left faster than goods could be produced. Reserves collapsed within weeks, forcing an abrupt reversal and deeper dependence. This is the paradox of stabilization mechanisms. They are designed for systems that are already healing. Applied too early, they expose weakness instead of curing it. Britain was asked to behave like a peacetime economy before it had regained peacetime capacity. What closed the trap was not the loan itself, but the loss of optionality. Once conditions were accepted, policy became externally constrained. Domestic priorities had to align with international expectations. Adjustment was no longer strategic, it was enforced. Britain did not fail, it complied. And in doing so, it locked in a trajectory where recovery would be slower, autonomy narrower, and future choices increasingly shaped by commitments made under pressure. Britain's decline did not arrive as a single moment of failure. There was no dramatic break, no sudden end to institutions or social order. Instead, the country entered a long unwinding, a gradual shift from global architect to system administrator. Empire was not lost in conquest, but in calculation. Maintaining overseas commitments became financially untenable, and withdrawal was reframed as modernization rather than retreat. Each step reduced strain, but also reduced influence. Autonomy was exchanged for predictability. Domestically, policy narrowed. Governments of different parties inherited the same constraints: balance of payments discipline, currency defense, and external credibility. Choices existed, but within boundaries set years earlier. Economic management became about maintaining equilibrium, not shaping direction. This is what controlled decline looks like. Living standards improved slowly. Institutions remained functional. Yet strategic freedom diminished. Britain no longer defined the rules of trade, finance, or monetary order. It responded to them. What makes this process difficult to recognize is its stability. Nothing appears broken. In fact, the system often feels responsibly managed. But the absence of crisis can mask the absence of agency. Britain's post-war experience reframes collapse as something quieter than expected. Power does not always disappear. Sometimes it is delegated, incrementally, legally, and voluntarily, until what remains is competence without sovereignty and administration without authorship of the future. At first glance, the comparison seems strained. Post-2008 America does not resemble wartime Britain. Its economy is larger, its currency dominant, its financial markets deeper and more liquid than any in history. There are no ration books, no physical devastation, no visible exhaustion. But structural parallels emerge once appearance is set aside. Like Britain in 1944, the United States operates a system sustained by confidence rather than surplus. Growth has increasingly relied on debt expansion, asset inflation, and the assumption that global demand for dollars will remain constant. Power is real, but it is leveraged. America also carries obligations that are not fully priced. Military commitments, financial backstops, and trade stabilization roles extend far beyond domestic priorities. These functions reinforce leadership, but they also require continuous funding. As with Britain, the cost is not paid up front. It accumulates quietly. The critical similarity lies in dependency. Britain depended on American financing to sustain trade. The United States depends on global participation in its financial system to sustain balance. Treasury markets, reserve holdings, and capital inflows are not guaranteed by force. They persist by belief. This does not imply imminent failure. Britain did not collapse when dependency became visible. Instead, its room to choose narrowed. America's position is stronger, but the mechanism is familiar. Dominance funded by trust, and trust maintained through policy choices that grow harder to reverse over time. Issuing the world's reserve currency grants extraordinary privilege. The United States can borrow in its own unit, run persistent deficits, and finance global activity at scale. Demand for dollars reduces immediate pressure that other nations would face under similar conditions. But reserve status is not a static benefit. It imposes obligations that shape domestic outcomes. To supply the world with liquidity, the U.S. must export dollars, which, by definition, means importing goods or capital. Over time, this arrangement pulls production outward and financial activity inward. The result is a subtle distortion. Manufacturing becomes less competitive. Asset markets grow outsized. Consumption is sustained by external funding rather than internal surplus. None of this feels like crisis. It feels efficient, but efficiency masks imbalance. Maintaining confidence in the dollar also limits adjustment. Sharp devaluation is unthinkable. Capital controls would undermine the system itself. Policy becomes about managing perception as much as fundamentals, keeping the machinery running smoothly even as stress accumulates. This is the burden few discuss. The dollar system must serve the world before it serves domestic rebalancing. When global demand slows or geopolitical trust weakens, the adjustment does not arrive cleanly. It arrives through volatility, intervention, and deeper reliance on financial channels. America's advantage endures, but like Britain's pound before it, that advantage increasingly constrains the very flexibility it once provided. The period after 2020 marked a turning point in how the American system operates. Policies once framed as extraordinary responses became normalized instruments of governance. Liquidity injections, fiscal expansion, and market backstops were no longer temporary bridges. They became structural supports. This shift was not ideological. It was functional. Faced with cascading risks, authorities acted to preserve stability. Each intervention worked in isolation. Markets recovered, institutions held, but the cumulative effect changed expectations. Participants adapted quickly. Risk pricing adjusted to the assumption of support. Volatility became something to be managed, not discovered. The boundary between public balance sheets and private markets blurred. Stability was no longer an outcome of resilience, but of coordination. This has consequences. When intervention becomes routine, withdrawal becomes destabilizing. Policies that once restored normal function now define it. The system remains intact, but increasingly dependent on administration rather than self-correction. The danger is not collapse, it is rigidity. Market signals lose clarity, adjustment is delayed, imbalances persist longer and grow larger. Like Britain defending sterling, America is defending continuity. Crisis management as permanent policy does not announce itself as decline. It presents as competence. Yet over time, the cost is borne quietly, in reduced flexibility, narrower choices, and a future where stability requires ever more deliberate maintenance. The modern parallel to Lend-Lease does not involve foreign governments waiting on shipments. It operates internally, through systems that have learned to function only with continued support. Liquidity, guarantees, and policy signaling now serve the role once played by emergency aid. Markets have adapted to this environment. Asset values reflect not just earnings or growth, but expectations of intervention. Governments plan budgets assuming favorable financing conditions. Institutions structure risk around the belief that disorder will be contained. Dependency is no longer visible, it is embedded. This creates a familiar dynamic. Support intended to prevent collapse becomes necessary to avoid disruption. Withdrawal threatens not failure, but adjustment, and adjustment has become politically and financially costly. As with Britain, the problem is not the initial intervention, but the permanence of the arrangement. Power shifts quietly in this environment. Decision-making centralizes. Flexibility declines. Policy choices are constrained by the need to sustain confidence, not to restore independence. The trap is subtle because it works. Stability is maintained. Growth continues, unevenly. Nothing forces a break. But autonomy erodes as systems align around support rather than resilience. Lend-Lease bound Britain's future to external approval. America's version binds its future to its own interventions, a system where exiting support becomes more dangerous than sustaining it indefinitely. Britain did not lose its position in a single decision or a single year. It adjusted, step by step, under pressure that always felt temporary and manageable. Each concession was rational, each compromise preserved stability, and over time, Those choices accumulated into a permanent shift in what the country could control. This is how decline often unfolds in advanced systems. Not through collapse, but through coordination. Not through panic, but through responsibility. Power is not taken, it is gradually constrained. The lesson is not that strength invites failure, but that strength financed by dependency narrows the future. When systems are designed to avoid disruption at all costs, they lose the ability to adapt freely. Britain's experience offers a quiet warning, not a prediction. The most powerful nations rarely fall apart in public view. They are restructured in private, through rules, obligations, and expectations that seem sensible in the moment. The question, then, is not whether stability can be preserved, but what is quietly being traded away to maintain it.